Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us on these Depolarization Thursdays. What a wonderful initiative by IFIT. Today, I'll be talking a bit about my research, a bit about some of the insights that I've learned as a political psychologist and neuroscientist studying both polarization and extremism and what it means to get out of extreme ideologies. And I guess to some extent, the little title is How to Depolarize the Brain, which for some people might initially sound quite surprising because it feels like we don't depolarize brains, we depolarize societies. And so what's the brain got to do with it? And so I hope that today I'll share some of the kind of empirical scientific insights that I've learned from this field and from my own work that show that actually we really should be paying attention to the brain because it can completely change how we view what it means to polarize and depolarize, and that understanding the processes that happened for individuals actually tells us a lot about what happens to our societies and how societies react to moments of crisis and to moments of change. So my name is Dr. Leor Zmigrod, and for the past decade, I've been doing this research where I've used methods from psychology, from neuroscience, from kind of the experimental sciences to study what is it about some people's brains that make them especially susceptible to extreme ideologies. And as I mentioned, this question itself is a bit controversial because for a long time in political science and our understanding of history, we really focus on external characteristics of a person when we're looking at why they might be at risk for extremism or polarization. So we look at their geographical location, at the ideologies that surround them, at their economic, demographic profile. Whenever there is a kind of event where someone has been radicalized, the first thing we look at is their age, their educational background, their income, their ethnic, historical background. And this is true both for extreme events when someone's been radicalized, but also when we want to understand general political movements and phenomena. The second that an election outcome comes out, we see everybody's voting patterns divided according to their demographic variables, to age, education, income, geography. Now, of course, all of those factors play a huge role in what ideologies appeal to people, when they might be swept up in certain movements or not. But there are also a lot of myths and assumptions and misconceptions embedded into that. Because actually, when we study individuals, a person's demographic makeup actually explains a very small proportion of their ideological attitudes. So, for instance, in my own research, I've seen that you can use demographic variables like people's background to explain about what we call 10% of the variance for their attitudes, why they might vote one way or another, why they might be dogmatic or not. But actually, in order to understand that person's attitudes in a much more comprehensive way, we can look at their psychology, we can look at particular traits and characteristics that they have in their emotion, their reason, different what we call individual differences that actually can allow us to predict a person's ideological beliefs up to 40% of the variance. So even if you're not a statistician, you're not sure what this means, you can see that we can do 4 times better by looking at psychological variables than by looking at demographic factors alone. And what this starts to get us to look at is how actually not all of us are equally susceptible to ideological narratives, to closed visions of life. And some people, by the nature of their personality, by the nature of their mental habits, are at baseline more vulnerable. And in my own experiments, I've really looked at a characteristic called cognitive rigidity, which is a trait where people lie on a kind of spectrum. So some people are more rigid thinkers, others are more flexible. Many of us are somewhere in between. So the majority of people are somewhere in the middle, and some people are very strongly kind of more rigid thinkers and others are more flexible. And when I look and try to map out, for instance, if for the people here today, if I asked you, do you think you're a rigid person? Most of us would say, of course not. I am the most rational, flexible thinker. I consider evidence in a balanced way. When we report on our own personality, we tend to think of ourselves in the most positive light. But actually, that's a good reason why it's important not to take people's words at face value and actually measure their thinking style directly, looking at their unconscious patterns of thinking, of reasoning, of responding emotionally to things. And when I measure people's rigidity, I don't just ask them how rigid they think they are. Instead, I invite them to play kind of neuropsychological games. Tests have been designed by neuropsychologists for 50 years to measure their cognitive style, their thinking style. And I use these kinds of tests that look like video games. They look like Solitaire, Tetris, Minesweeper, all those games that we are used to playing on our phones or on our computers. They just look like games. But through these games, I'm able to measure how a person thinks without necessarily them knowing what it is that I'm measuring. And I've found that the people who are most rigid in their thinking, the ones who, when there is a moment of change, they try to avoid it. When there is a need to think about something in a more creative, expansive way, they try to avoid it and stick to the more narrow approach. Those people tend to be, in their political lives, the most ideological. So the most rigid thinkers, even in games of Tetris, Solitaire, chess, will also be the minds that, when it comes to it, are the ones that are going to support ideological violence the most, the ones who will polarize most quickly, the ones who will adhere to extreme ideological doctrines most quickly and most passionately. There is something about the way in which their brains are thinking and computing information about the world that makes them gravitate towards closed ideologies that give them answer, that give them certainty, that give them stability. Because really, ideologies try to offer you a vision of life that has no change. It gives you rules for living, rules for thinking, and once you're in it, that's kind of, you don't need to change. Actually, it's important that you don't doubt or change those ideological convictions. And so in the research that I've done, I've looked at people's thinking styles, even gone into their brains, the biology of their brains and their bodies, and really seen this connection where the way in which people's brains and bodies work in everyday life can predict whether they'll be more ideological and dogmatic when it comes to politics, nationalism, religion, any of those ideologies. And actually, one of the most interesting insights from this research is that it's not necessarily a left versus right kind of distinction. Some people, for a long time in political psychology, there's been this idea that if you're looking at rigidity of thought, well, you'll only find that on the political right, because the political right is traditionally the side of the status quo, of keeping things the same. And so there's been this hypothesis called the rigidity of the right, that the right is the side of rigid thinkers. But in fact, when I studied this experimentally, what I found was, rather than the right being rigid and the left being flexible, it was more about the extremism of their beliefs and identities. So both on the right and on the left, we find that the kind of most passionate partisans are the ones who tend to have that rigid thinking profile, whereas those who are more moderate, more independent, more suspicious of pre-established doctrines, those tend to be the most flexible thinkers with kind of adaptable behavior in everyday life and a really expansive, fluid imagination. And so that tells us that actually it's not so much about what a person believes and more about how they believe. And that's a really like a kind of insight that unlocks a lot of important both work in practice, policy, and in our theories. Because when you look at radicalization and terrorism services and the way in which policymakers analyze extreme ideologies, they very much bucket them according to the content, to the mission of the ideology, but what that person believes, whether it's far right, far left, religious of one kind, religious of a different kind, environmentalist. We bucket things according to what the ideology claims. But actually, psychologically, it's a lot more powerful to look not at what a person believes, but how rigidly they engage with those ideas, how passionately they hold on to those identities and beliefs. And in my book, The Ideological Brain, which has now been translated into 18 languages, so it's available in your preferred language to read and listen, I really explore what happens to a brain when it gets immersed in a rigid, extreme ideology, how does that actually affect the biology of our brain, the way in which we psychologically approach anything? Because if there's one important insight that I've learned is that our ideologies are not divorced from our minds or our brains. They're really interconnected. And that tells us that actually the stakes of trying to solve polarization, depolarization are not just societal. It's not just about, okay, we want more harmonious societies. Solving these issues actually changes the makeup of the human being, the different kinds of people that we are. Because if when you actually engage with an extreme ideology, yes, that restricts the adaptability of your thinking. I found it restricts the kinds of emotions that you feel. It can make you more numb, less empathetic, less sensitive in everyday life. It means that those really strong, dogmatic, polarizing ideologies change the human beings that we are most fundamentally, biologically, neurobiologically. And so suddenly the stakes are a lot more personal, right? We're not just trying to solve big social problems, though that's really important too, but we're trying to solve really existential problems that people face very much day to day. And especially when we live in a world now, which through both social media, but increasingly AI, is really trying to create quite repetitive versions of people. People are very predictable, right? That's what the algorithms are based on, predictability. People who are narrow in their thinking, who repeat the same routines and habits. We're making ourselves more rigid, and we have so many rigidifying forces that shape really the kinds of human beings that we are. So there is this really dangerous interplay between technology, prevailing ideologies, obviously financial and political interests, that actually really affect what kind of human being, what kind of human brains each of us has. But the important thing is that actually there is scope for change, because it's not that we have a brain that's fixed forever. Our brains are very, very malleable, very plastic. They can respond to change and our environments. They can respond to our choices. So actually, even brains who are most susceptible to polarizing extreme ideologies have the capacity to change. All of us, maybe we exist on the spectrum, but we can move our position on that spectrum. We can be our most flexible versions of our brains or the most rigid versions of our brains. And that's where education policy comes into play, where technology policy comes into play. And I think and I hope this is what the book kind of inspires readers who engage with it, is really a kind of almost personal reckoning. What kind of person, human being brain do you want to have? Because that has just huge implications. And until we see that if we want to depolarize our societies, we also have to depolarize our brains and understand what does it mean for a brain to think anti-ideologically, to constantly be in that space of doubt, of flexibility, being receptive to evidence and nuance, and not shutting down is hugely important, because it's about what kinds of human beings we create of ourselves and what kind of leaders we end up electing. Do we value and cherish leaders who are rigid, never changing their convictions and beliefs, or do we want flexible, adaptable leaders?